Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the afternoon portion of our program. I'm Andy Cutchins, a senior fellow and research professor here at Georgetown, and it's really a great pleasure and honor to be chairing this panel about drivers of political change, or not change. I have a colleague who virtually every year since 2003 has been predicting that Putin will fall in the next year. One of these days he's going to be right. Then on the other hand, people talk about Vladimir Putin and the political system as if, yes, he's going to be president for life and perhaps the afterlife. Probably the reality is somewhere in between that. And I think we have a really super group of people to kind of discuss potential drivers of political change in Russia's future. You have a program with more details about each of them. Let me just say quickly to my left, Mikhail Dmitriev. Mikhail Dmitriev, let me say one thing about him that's not in the program, that he was the only person to virtually predict in 2011 that if there were allegations and the proof of falsification in the Duma elections, there would be major social opposition, socially mobilized opposition in Russia. He's the guy. So listen carefully to what he has to say in his presentation. And let me just correct one thing about his biography, that he has not worked and does not work with Lomonosov University in Moscow. Now, he did work with the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace, and that's where we first met. After Mikhail, Elizaveta Osetinskaya will speak. She is one of Russia's best-known, most distinguished journalists, former editor of Forbes in Russia, Vedomosti newspaper, and other media outlets. Currently, she is taking a vacation at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is, I'm kind of kidding, where she is a fellow in the School of Journalism. And I must say, having three sisters that went to the University of California, Berkeley, I'm a big fan of Berkeley, and having worked there myself. And then on the end, we have Daniel Treisman from one of the sister institutions in the University of California, University of California, Los Angeles. Dan was quick to point out last night to me that, Andy, have you seen the ratings that now UCLA is rated higher than UC Berkeley? Thank you, Dan. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm very grateful for that. Dan is a political scientist, I think amongst the very best political scientists in the United States and the world, working on Russia. And in fact, in my course in the spring here at Georgetown called Power and Wealth in Russia, about 1/3 of the readings are by Treisman. So I'm doing what I can to help your book sales, Dan. So without any further ado, you didn't come here to hear me. Let me turn the floor over to Mikhail Dmitriev.
Thank you, and I have some PowerPoints. I shall base my presentation on some pretty fresh empirical evidence, which probably will help to better understand the dynamics of socio-political change in Russia. Sergei Alexashenko in his previous session, mentioned that, or hinted that perhaps economic developments in Russia may seem to be quite boring. In stark contrast with that, we had, in terms of socio-political landscape, a roaring 3 months during summertime, since the announcement of the retirement age. We had a sharp and unexpected surge in public discontent. Approval ratings of Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Medvedev, the governors, the State Duma have plummeted. There was, in particular, the Medvedev's rating had fallen to the historic lows never observed before. And most interestingly, propensity for economic and political protests went up suddenly to the levels unforeseen since the end of 1990s, when we had a default, and it was still there was still a wave of protests instigated by deep and prolonged recession of 1990s. But we must distinguish in that regard between substantials and circumstantials. Increase in retirement age was clearly a catalyst of this discontent, but by no means a true cause of what was happening. We understood that when we were lucky enough to carry out our new qualitative sociological survey just a month before the announcement of the increase in retirement age. That was still a dead still period yet. Nothing was telling about the coming storm. Everything was quiet. But when we got the first data from our focus groups in end April, early May, we said to ourselves, we are on something truly momentous. And we could expect that things will start changing really fast. And so they did. So what's about these changes? Basically, we revealed 3 directions of fundamental change in mass consciousness, which could underpin what's happening now in terms of socio-political dynamics. First is the growing appetite for risk-taking and rising demand for change. Second, the weakening expectations for strong political leadership, alongside with the rising demand for redistributive social justice. And the third is a dramatic transition from external to internal locus of control. Just briefly about each of these directions of change. First, the request of change. Since late 1990s, after a prolonged recession, it was typical for Russian public to be risk-averse. And this remained true up throughout the first 2 decades of the 2000s of the new century. Very recently, polls by FCIOM and the Vada Center indicated that up to 80 or even 90% of respondents were demanding some sort of change. But a relatively new development, which popped up only by May, was that the share of individuals which not just demanded change, but wanted decisive, sweeping, and large-scale changes, went up to more than half of respondents. It have risen by 15 percentage points in just a few months. And when we tested that in our focus groups, we got quite a revealing picture. We suggested a sort of psychological projective test. Here, the picture, not particularly bright one. In the left, it depicts the nature of the test. We suggested to individuals, well, there is a way to some sort of nice, ideal future Russia. One way is a long, bumpy, dirty, and pretty slow road, which circumvents some unknown area. And there is another way, which is a shortcut through a sort of green lawn, but potentially this is an untested way, and it may be a perilous swamp. Which way would you choose? Intuitively, we expected that everybody will will prefer the tested, albeit slow way. Not at all. 70% of respondents preferred riskier, but a short way to the target. And that's the first area of change. Another one is reliance on strong political leader. Basically, throughout all 2000s, we expected this, we were observing more or less the same attitude towards the issue of strong leadership, not always associated with Vladimir Putin, but still, much of the public was ready to confer all but unlimited powers to a strong leader in the hope that such leader could resolve most of existing problems. And now it suddenly changed. When we suggested a trade-off between strong political leadership and social justice, we've got those results. 80% of respondents preferred social justice to strong political leadership. This is well pronounced in the prevalence of redistributive social justice, which means that individuals do expect more just distribution of income and wealth. It is well confirmed by latest sociology. In the explanations, what did Vladimir Putin failed to achieve during his previous stays in office, among 6 top issues ticked by respondents, 4 of them were related to distributive justice, distributive social justice. Basically, that becomes the major topic of popular aspirations. There are some essential tips about the nature of the social justice. It is quite non-specific. It has been studied by inter alia recent survey by Carnegie Endowment scholars, which was published in late 1917. This demand for social justice is non-specific, unrealistic, and irrational. It is anchored, locked to specific symbolic emotional anchors, such as free education and health. This is a sacred idea. Unchangeable retirement age, perception of pensioners as the most deprived social group, and mistrust to migrants. Basically, we had studied the role of these irrational anchors in one of our previous research, and we discovered that when the respondents are challenged rationally, when these social anchors are challenged rationally by moderators in the focus groups, we get a sort of phenomenon of logical abstraction. Our respondents began to avoid any rational discussion of the issues. They were just denying. And this is what we were observing during the summertime when the retirement age was announced. Official media tried to address the issue rationally, and the public was ignoring any rational argument about the mounting risks of ignoring the issue of population aging and how much cost it will be if the retirement age is not increased and remains the same. But any, albeit unfounded, rhetorical and even stupid arguments regarding the usefulness of preservation of retirement age, they were easily adopted. And the next important shift is the shift from external to internal locus of control. In personality psychology, locus of control is the way in which individual attributes the solutions to his or her problems, where these solutions are inside himself or herself, or they depend on the influence of outside forces. There was just only a very brief period in the late 1990s when sociology observed an activation of internal locus of control after a decade of prolonged recession in the 1990s, when most of the individuals realized that they can no longer rely on the state in the resolution of their own problems. But as soon as the oil prices began to increase, social transfers from the state were rising up quite dramatically, and the individuals returned to their traditional external locus of control modality, simply relying on the state in resolving their own problems. And now suddenly we discovered that once again there was a pretty impressive and dramatic shift to internal locus of control. People were no longer relying on the state. Here are the answers, the distribution of the answers in our focus groups, which was particularly important in the provinces. It was shocking to see how strong the shift to internal locus of control was in the provinces. 95% of respondents were choosing that in solving their problems, they can rely on themselves only, and there is no hope of the help of the state. And there were just shocking responses in the focus groups, like, for example, in pretty depressed provincial town, rather impoverished individuals were explaining, our problems are in our own mentality. Nothing can help unless we change our mentality. We never heard that before. It was really a very new phenomenon. There are two important implications from this shift from external to internal locus of control. First is the influence of state-controlled media. With external locus of control, individuals are likely to accept the messages coming from official TV channels like a sort of parental guidance, which is formative to their opinion. When there is a shift to internal locus of control, it clearly activates critical thinking and skepticism. And the impact of official media is likely to diminish, whereas the impact of social media or information acquired from the neighbors or friends can be increasing. And this is what we see in the most recent sociological data. The influence or the trust to official TV channels has declined by 10% in the last 2 years. And what was increasing is the trust to social media, to relatives and friends, or no trust to anybody at all. And the second area of influence, basically individuals who realized that they can no longer rely on the state in resolving their problems are more likely to be interested in horizontal, not hierarchical, grassroots organizations. Basically, we have here some of the drawings from projective tests in the focus groups, which depict the attitude of individuals to the society, to their horizontal connections, like a piece of the sunflower, like a grain inside the sunflower, and a negative attitude towards the states. This small drawing depicts the mistrust in the state as a disturbing element of social justice. Social justice and the state are no longer associated with each other, in this picture at least. Basically, this environment creates a potential for new social movements, grassroots-based and not organized by the state. But at the same time, what we discovered in our another element of our survey was that there is countervailing fragmentation forces which make it difficult for emergence of large-scale national political movements for the moment. What we did, it was a very small pilot survey based on social media. We analyzed the psychological profiles of a number of social media users, both opponents and proponents of official policy. We used Big Five personality test and Wiesbaden personality test. I wouldn't comment much on technicalities, but we revealed statistically significant differences between the profiles of opponents and proponents of official policy. There are some really important revealing implications from this with regard to the potential of protest movements in Russia at this phase. Basically, if we look at the profiles of opponents of official policy, they are pretty open to outside world. They do not divide the world into us and them. They are resilient to official norms and ideology. They are open to new ideas, but at the same time, they are not attached to any type of established ideology or well-structured ideas about policy and society. Their aspirations are highly circumstantial. They are specific, local, and there is a narrow sense of identity, not a global, nationwide sense of identity among them. What is also important, they are eager to draw attention to themselves, and much of the protest activity is driven by self-expression. Protests are regarded by many opponents of official policy as a way to express themselves. So what does that mean in regard to protest potentials? Protests for this moment, and this is also confirmed by some sociology. I wouldn't present the data, but it is available from Levada Center. Protests tend to be value-driven rather than concept-driven. Protest-related information is spread like a wildfire through social networks. But this environment is conducive mainly to local and fragmented actions on specific occasions, not for the nationwide movements. There are at least three reasons for fragmentation, which can be identified from our surveys. First, lack of unifying concept of ideology, which is conducive to heterogeneous agendas. Second, bias towards individualistic self-expression through protests, which is accompanied by interpersonal rivalries, particularly among the protest leaders. And the third is lack of transitive hierarchical rules for value conflict resolution, which means that values become rather divisive more than unifying. And with regard to the fact that protests are merely value-driven, not concept-driven, this becomes a divisive factor. So the implications, the final few slides. These fundamental shifts in public opinion, in our understanding, are quite consistent with the rise of radical counter-elitist populism, which has already been observed in a number of countries of Europe and in the United States. In Russia, it was deferred mainly by Crimean affairs. But still, if we look at the major features, fatigue from political status quo, demand for a rational redistributive justice in combination with growing demand for radical change, these are the features of radical populism elsewhere. Russia is not very much different with regard to that. We have identified the rise of the populist wave first in late 1913. And we abstained from publishing the findings from this survey, simply because this rise of the populist wave then was interrupted by the Crimean affairs so abruptly that our findings have become obsolete. And for at least 3 years, the politics was business as usual, with strong influence of state-controlled media, high levels of support of the authorities, both in internal and domestic politics, and everything seemed to be within the established trends. Now this is the second populist wave, and it took 3 years of protracted economic recession when household incomes plunged by 10% and didn't recover yet, to revive the populist attitudes and intentions once again. If not for the Crimean affairs, I think the rise of radical populism in Russia was more or less, would have been more or less aligned in time with that of Europe and the United States. So the challenges for economic policy. The main victim of this new rise of populism can be potentially sound macroeconomic and fiscal policy, which Sergei Alexashenko vividly described in the previous session. Basically, this new strong demand for unrealistic redistributive justice gives an edge to populist politicians. And this is an unwelcome indication for the Russian authorities with their tight fiscal and monetary approaches to policy. Political challenges. Even a strong and determined and sensitive political leader in these circumstances will be challenged with growing public negativism, falling approval ratings. Populist politicians will prosper on that. Shift to internal locus of control limits the capacity of public, of state-owned, state-controlled media to mitigate the impact of the growing radical populist sentiments. And does regard protest potential. Shift to internal locus of control does really stimulate demand for grassroots self-organization. In combination with rising propensity to protests, this can lead to the rise of a variety of protest movements on different occasions, various issues, all across the country. But in a sense, the history repeats itself, and here I'm quoting I'm just giving a quick short quotation from a very thoughtful Robertson book about history of protests in Russia, who points that the late 1990s protests were primarily local in nature, based on narrowly conceived notions of identity, and making demands which were largely material, exclusive, and conservative or defensive in nature. This seems to be the exact description of the kind of protest movements which we can observe in the country for the moment. The implications for the authority. The authorities are likely to have to be content with the low approval ratings and smaller electoral margins, but I don't believe that there are particularly strong odds of losing political control because of the likely fragmented nature of these political movements. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. That's a great transition, I think, from the discussion before lunch about the economy to our discussion. Let me turn now to Elizaveta.
You have no presentation.
Yeah, I don't need this. Yeah, thank you. So here I have two news, good news and bad news. And I'd rather start with bad news. I think that Russian media industry, in a common sense, what we understand under media industry, is very unlikely to be a source for any changes, including political changes. But despite of the bad news, I also have a good news. I think, and in my observations, that are more qualitative rather than quantitative, because I'm more practitioner. I'm not a scientist at all, despite of my name at Berkeley. I'm doing very practical work there, doing my media startup, The Bell. So the good news is there is, I would say, a renaissance of content in Russian media space, but this content is provided not by established media organizations, but sometimes by brave individuals, sometimes bloggers, sometimes investigative reporters, or something that could be called alternative media, the media that appear despite of the tough regulation and overall political pressure that most of journalists and industry professionals experience from the government and regulation branches. So here I come, so I will explain it a little bit more details, and maybe there is a sense to give some observation of the current media landscape. So why it happened with established media? Because this is nearly impossible to create a sustainable business model for any media organization if you are not aligned with the government of Russia. I mean, in a broader way, not necessarily to be owned by the government, but I mean to be in somehow good or decent relationships with the government. Well, what is true for media industry all around the world, that it's hard to create sustainable business model for any media anywhere in the world, but especially tough in Russia because of this political factor. So in practice, that means that most of media should in some way, not fully, but in some way to have certain sponsors and to apply fundraising. And it could be either someone who is accepted and approved by the state, Russian state. I mean, it could be private businessman or private company, but in somewhere to be in establishment. Or it could be international financing. But here we have interesting phenomena. First of all, it makes the media outlets that get, it's still possible, but in some weird ways, But for media that get this financing, it's really hard to sustain giving the legislation and all this foreign agent thing from one side. And from another side, there is a significant part of well-educated and so-called advanced, I call them advanced Russians, who really don't like the idea of media to be supported from abroad. And I observed that this tendency came, at least, well, of course, some of them comes from propaganda and the whole emotional attitude within the country. But at least on 50%, it comes from the informational pressure from abroad, saying that Russia is, it's weird, awful, and all this media coverage, I mean, that is considered by, at least by some of advanced Russians, as too much. And of course, people tend to be more defensive. So, and that means also that people switch from traditional media and established media organizations more into the space of social media, YouTube channels. So we here have three major sources. I would name, first of all, YouTube, then, and of course, people who deliver content on the platform. Then I would highlight, of course, Facebook and Vkontakte, and definitely Telegram. That is quite unique phenomenon for Russia, not just a messenger, but the system of different media organizations created in the shape of Telegram channels. And some of them have enormous amount of subscribers, like 50,000 subscribers, 150,000 subscribers, 300,000 subscribers. So those are people reading these outlets, but this is alternative medias. Outlets, quite often they're anonymous. And people read this media quite frequently. So if we compare the numbers, for example, YouTube monthly reach in Russia exceeds 40 million users. Vkontakte has even more. When, let's say, the most popular traditional media, RBC, has like about 10 to 15 million users. The same Medusa does, maybe less. So the same, the state-owned outlet Itar-TASS has, I mean, the monthly reach of this organization. So they are not as significant as social media space. And what is also quite phenomenal in this sphere, the state and the so-called the Kremlin, maybe because of experience with blocking Telegram, maybe for some other reasons, decided up to now not to build the great Russian firewall, but to use this space for its own interests. And this is very interesting phenomenon that, for example, in Telegram, that is used by the most influential Russians, including government members and people working for the state companies and the oligarchs and people from the Forbes list. So, and basically attempts to block this channel, this messenger, actually failed. So, but that's interesting phenomenon that Kremlin basically took this information space and started using it for its own goals. So some unknown people created number of Telegram channels that have quite substantial reach, like this is hundreds of thousands of people, where they distributed either compromat, sometimes it's direct compromise, not confirmed, but spoiling and poisoning the media space. Or sometimes disinformation, or sometimes decent information. And if you compare, for example, these anonymous Telegram channels with the Telegram channels of established media, including so-called liberal ones or democratic, they are tiny. Most of them, except maybe Medusa. So it's hard to compare them with just anonymous Telegram channels that are followed by hundreds of thousands of people. The same situation you can observe in the YouTube space. So one of the most popular YouTube gurus in Russia, they're of course Navalny with millions of subscribers, the opposition leader, Yuri Dudь, who has millions of subscribers. But also, from time to time, you can see attempts of the government that officially uses this channel for achieving its own goals. For example, this is a story revealed by the journalists that Kremlin paid to, or promised to pay, to one of the most popular YouTube bloggers, Gnoyny, and his other name is Slava KPSS. So it's hard to translate. Both of the names. It's
Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, he's a young guy. He's 28 years old. He is very popular and became popular because of rap battles. He's rap producing, so not singer, but the poetry. So he was ordered the native ad. It's like native story from the Kremlin. Another story, maybe more weird, is how Zolotov, accused by Navalny in corruption, immediately did the same. So he punched back, but he used YouTube. So if Roskomnadzor blocks YouTube, Zolotov has no space to answer, because it's hard to imagine this picture, this video going on channel 2 soon after Sunday show. So it would be Sunday show of Kisilev or Vladimir Solovyov. So it's hard to imagine, but what is not possible on established media, it is possible on YouTube and an alternative, using alternative platform. So another example, of course, you all watched this Bashirov and Petrov interview produced Russia Today on a very cheap, in a very cheap, fast way, and also distributed on YouTube. So this is, I would say, the double-line street. So when democratic or leader or YouTube liberal blogger or just not pro-government blogger sends the signal, he immediately gets the signal back. So Kremlin is getting more and more efficient in doing so. So another phenomenon, in my view, is that despite of image of total control, almost everything, almost all information is available in the web. That's quite outstanding that just in a few weeks, Fontanka and Rosbalt were able to distribute information about so-called GRU people with numbers of their passports. And we can give a lot of examples like that. For example, there is a massive distribution of information about a high school student who was asked in the school by police officer about her participants in the recent protests. So the information that she was asked questions immediately was distributed widely on the web. So it's nearly impossible to hide anything in current Russia. Almost every information can be reached. At the same time, we observe another contradictory phenomenon that Michael just mentioned, and you basically quantitatively supported the ideas that I wanted to stress based on my experience, that it's almost impossible to engage people to massive protest against anything like pension reform. For example, all information about pension reform and its injustice and all protest intentions of opposition leaders of various colors, from Navalny to Communist Party, was free on the web. But the actual protest was, I would say, quite poor. So it was not so significant to get the government to change anything and to change pension reform significantly, because I think that was sort of the plan to reduce this pension age for women, just to give people something. But at the same time, those local events, like injustice in particular cases, let's say lawsuit against the doctor Yelena Misurina, or this questioning the kids, are the strong factor to people to collect together and to protest against very specific events that are important for this particular small group. And I have to say that in my experience, it's quite efficient. So people in these small cases are more likely to reach their goals and to get something from the government and to achieve certain compromise. While the massive protests and massive the attempts to invite people to protest massively are mostly lead to failure. So just as concluding observations, so I would highlight two major thoughts. So despite the unprecedented, and this is quite positive, unprecedented pressure and very tough legislation for the media industry, overall media industry, almost every piece of information, important information, is available in Russia, and it's possible to make it available. And the second information, the second observation is that the impact of this free information on the ability to change political system as a whole is very, very limited, but can be efficient in some minor and local cases that probably nothing stopped to use. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a fascinating presentation. It sounds like Russia media space is as open and free as, in some ways, as it could be.
As it could be under current tough circumstances.
Okay. Dan, let's turn it over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Andy, and it's an honor to be on this panel with Mikhail and Elizaveta. Of course, as you'll see, my presentation is very consistent with what they say. It's very difficult speaking after two such informed experts to come up with anything totally new. But there will be some nuances of difference. So if we try to understand what might happen in the next Putin term, I think it's helpful to look back and understand the past Putin terms and the Medvedev term. And if we were to characterize, if the task is to characterize what happened very simply in those terms, I would say that the first three terms, as was discussed this morning, were really a time of incredible economic growth and modernization. And I'll get back to this in a second. Putin's third term was a moment when he really tried to freeze the social and political consequences of the modernization that had just taken place. So here I agree with Vladislav, maybe not go back to the 17th century, but definitely stop moving forward towards a more socially modern society. And then, so the question is, what comes next? Just to give a little bit of evidence of this dramatic modernization in the first three terms, well, first of all, if we look at GDP per capita, increased very dramatically, about 4 times. If we look at some indicators of consumer durables, living standards, the number of cars per 100 households doubled. This is between 2000 and 2012, so the end of the third term of the Putin-Medvedev team. TVs per 100 households, already pretty high in 2000, higher in 2012. Personal computers, almost no households had a personal computer in 2000. By 2012, 86% did. Mobile phone subscriptions per person, almost none in 2000, 1.45 per person in 2012. Internet penetration increased very dramatically. The number of Russians taking trips abroad beyond the CIS more than tripled from 10 million to 33 million in 2012. The level of higher education, already quite high in 2000, 22% of those employed increased to 30%. And finally, lawyers are often a measure of the professionalization of an economy. Number of lawyers also increased. Okay, and then at least in part, a consequence of that was this. Muscovites in very large numbers going out into the streets to protest against falsified elections. And that was, as you recall, the setting in which Putin came back for his, well, third term, but fourth if you count Medvedev as part of the same group. And what were the key policies in Putin's fourth term, the key goals? Well, first of all, as I said, the goal of freezing social and political consequences of modernization, preventing any of those changes which had already taken place from bleeding over into the political sphere and threatening the regime's control. And this was in part done through a campaign of, well, a return to traditional values, Orthodox Christian values. It was associated with an attempt to really control the media more effectively than in the past, and stepped up surveillance and selective repression. And here's just a bit of evidence of that from an article by Kirill Rogov. The graph just shows the number of legal cases of political repression classified by human rights observers. And we see this went up quite substantially after 2011. Kirill also points out that most of the increase is associated with what we might call persecution of Muslims. Most of these additional cases are against Muslims who are accused of extremism or terrorism, but not all. So increasing repression, and another indicator of this new strategy, well, Google provides a transparency report every year in which it records how many requests it has received from different countries' governments to remove material from its websites, and primarily here we're thinking of YouTube. And we see that Russia in recent years has really gone off the charts in terms of making an enormous number of requests, 12,000 requests to Google to take down material. For comparison, the US level was about 1,000, and the US was quite active in making such requests. And almost all of these are for, well, the vast majority of these are supposedly on grounds of national security. So this is part of the media control, the tightening of domestic control policy. Okay, so if that was Putin's domestic strategy, I want to raise the question what worked, what didn't work, and what does that imply for the coming term? So I think we have to say that there were some clear successes from the Kremlin's point of view. The protest wave of 2011, 2012 died out. The Kremlin managed subsequent elections without any major problems. After Crimea, although not before, Putin's rating rebounded. So here, Mikhail already showed Putin's rating. We see it was drifting downwards up until the beginning of 2014. Then Crimea, it shoots upwards, and it stays more or less above 80% for a very long time. So some successes. Was the Kremlin successful in freezing social and political modernization in Russia? Well, they did manage to freeze GDP per capita growth. So congratulations. So Sergei showed this version of this graph this morning. So basically, GDP per capita, PPP, stuck at about 25,000 and hasn't really changed since 2011. But if we look at many other indicators of modernization, in fact, they continue to rise. So if we look at cars and TVs per 100 households, these increased for some years. Now the trend has reversed, but it's still a lot higher than it was when Putin came back. Computer ownership has really increased dramatically. So just in the years of Putin's third term, from 2012 to 2017, is the latest data, computer ownership among rural households increased from 50%, or 50 computers per 100 households, to 100 computers per 100 households. Really a very dramatic change in the countryside. Mobile phones, well, Russia had already surpassed the US back in the early 2000s. Ownership of mobile phones actually dropped a bit during the global financial crisis. It has since then been gradually increasing again. Internet use in Russia, really explosive or continuing very high increase in penetration during this repressive third term under Putin. And we see social networks, as Elizaveta was talking about, the number of the proportion of people who check social networks at least daily has gone up above a third of the population. Trips abroad, they went up. Initially, they went down, but still, if you look at the average for Putin's third term, higher than before. Percent of those employed who had bachelor's degrees also continued to increase to a really unusually high level. So the percent of the US labor force that has completed higher education is much lower. So all of that suggests to me that social and political modernization didn't exactly stop. A lot of it has continued. What happened to political approval of the government, of Putin? Well, as I showed you a minute ago, Putin's rating soared after Crimea, stayed pretty high. But let me make a couple more points. So the first point is that, as has been discussed today, the rating fell pretty dramatically after the announcement of this pension reform. Another point is that while Putin's rating stayed high, above 80%, we see that the rating of Medvedev, the prime minister, after rising in response to Crimea, has been falling very sharply and is now under 30%. This is Levada Center data. Basically, the Medvedev approval rating has converged with the pretty low rating of the government. And the Duma was never very high, but it's also been coming down. So if we look at this graph as of 2018, it suggests to me that approval of the government, broadly speaking, the authorities, broadly speaking, is about 30 to 33%, about a third, while Putin's popularity remains much higher, but so it seems at least on a downward trend. So what's driving approval of government down? Well, first of all, it doesn't seem to be the economy. So if we look at 2016 to the present, consumer confidence has actually been increasing for most of that period. This is Levada Center data on consumer confidence. It's gone down recently, but the trend since beginning of 2016 has been up during this period when popularity of Medvedev, government, Duma, even Putin at the end has gone down. So this suggests to me, well, one possible explanation for the falling popularity of government is that this strategy of the third Putin term, this strategy of propaganda of fear, as you might call it, of scaring the population into a rally behind the Kremlin, projecting this image of external threats and using the media very actively to propagate that idea, this strategy may be stopping to work so effectively. And let me show you some figures. So first of all, if you ask Russians where they get most of their news about the country, the percentage that say TV is still extremely high, but it's been coming down. And the percentage that say they get their news from internet publications or from social networks has been increasing. And we see this since 2014. So slightly less focus on TV, more focus, as Elizaveta was saying, on social networks and internet. Do they trust the Russian mass media? Well, the percentage saying they don't trust has increased pretty dramatically since August 2015. The percent saying they trust the media has fallen dramatically. So there's this huge evidence of distrust of the media, really since this strategy of turning the media into a vehicle of propaganda began. Maybe the war fever, another element of this propaganda fear strategy, is also becoming less effective or becoming less clear. So do you think Russia faces a military threat from other countries? Well, in 2015, more than 2/3 of Russians said yes. In the heat of the Crimea confrontation with the West, people were afraid. Fear seems to be falling. If you look at attitudes towards the US, so this is the proportion of people who say they basically feel negative towards the US. Over time, we've seen a gradual increase with these spikes at moments of international confrontation over Kosovo, over Iraq, over Georgia, and definitely over Crimea. But we also see that the percentage with negative views about the US has fallen a lot since the Crimea peak and is now really relatively low. It doesn't seem to be off the long-term trend. So mirror image of that is also more positive feeling towards the US. What kind of policy in relation to the West would you support? Well, when Russians are asked that, since 2015, they've always, more have always favored broadening relations with the West than reducing ties with the West. And there seems to be an upward trend towards accommodation with the West, or at least broadening economic, political, and cultural ties. So clearly, a lot of latent support for an improvement of relations with the West. This, Mikhail already pointed out this poll result, but we see a very big increase in the percentage of people who say that decisive major changes are needed. A clear majority at this point, 57%. Only 10% say that no changes are needed, let things remain as they are. So again, an indicator of considerable discontent and, as Mikhail said, a readiness to take some risk to get to somewhere better. So just to wrap up what I think all of this suggests, well, between 2000 and 2011, Russia became much more modern. When this led to demands for more open politics, protests in the streets, Putin tried to freeze the consequences of modernization through rallying the population with external threats, with traditional values, tighter control of the media, selective repression. That succeeded in overcoming the immediate political crisis, in stabilizing things, But many aspects of social modernization have continued. Today, the rally behind Putin seems to be wearing out. We never should say anything like that with too much confidence, because these trends can easily reverse, but that seems to be the case at the moment. There also seems to be growing distrust of the media and a rise of the use of YouTube and alternative sources, as Elisabetta was saying. Considerable discontent under the surface. So the reaction to pension reform, I agree with Mikhail. I think that it's a symptom more than an independent cause of current discontent, that there was an underlying negativity about current policies in the regime, which the pension reform catalyzed and brought to the surface, and desire for major change, including normalization with the West. Now, what that means in terms of future policy and future confrontations, perhaps between the regime and society, cannot be confidently predicted. But I think it together with the other presentations, suggests an image of a society which is really quite different from the society 3 years ago, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. And this helps to think about the possibilities for future developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We have about 10 minutes that we can use, because we've already gone a little bit over time. All three presentations are fascinating, drawing a very not only complex, but kind of curious picture. Increasing desire or readiness for social protest, increasing readiness to take risks, but not seeing that these social movements or desires are quite fragmented and not likely to have a major impact on politics, the political system in the next 6 years. Media, a lot of interesting things happening, but also very fragmented and not likely to be a driver of major political change. Dan, concluding a little bit more open-mindedly, or with the question, really, but it sounds like I don't think you fundamentally disagree with these conclusions. So my question is to all three of you, what can you imagine changing this picture, which seems to be quite fluid?
Well, shall I start?
Sure.
You have to expect the unexpected.
Yeah. It is Russia.
It's Russia, but in authoritarian regimes or even semi-democracies, generally, a lot of the changes that occur don't occur because it could be predicted in advance because of some fundamental underlying change in circumstances. Incumbents can react to visible trends and challenges. What they're not good at reacting to is the unexpected, and sometimes the unexpected is the mistakes of the leaders themselves. So I think we tend to be, we can underestimate the potential for change by ignoring the possibility of something truly unexpected. Now, it's impossible to put odds on, say, a leader making some huge mistake, but I think small mistakes we've seen more of coming from the Putin administration. I would say, I mean, it's always somewhat a matter of debate whether something's a mistake or just a particular choice which maybe you don't understand. So pension reform, perhaps you could say, it's not a mistake. Maybe in the long run it'll turn out to be a very smart move. He'll get this done, protest will die down. But I think there are a lot of very questionable judgments in the policies that have been chosen. None of them have really exploded, pension reform a little bit, but I could imagine something like that. I can imagine bad decisions under pressure, especially in the context of some kind of international crisis, could lead to change.
Fair enough. Elisabetta?
So I think in this very ambiguous, I would say, situation, what we can expect is some changes coming from black swan situations. And also, coming after that, poor and failing reactions of the local governments and governance. Because as we can judge by recent elections, governors' elections, the phenomenon that we faced with, I think it's the result of extremely poor governance in these areas, not just protest movements of people. And I think that also government, I mean the federal government, understands that. And Russian regions are managed unequally. Russia is very unequal. I mean, there are richer and poorer areas. But definitely, Sobyanin understood something in advance compared to Orlova, who didn't. And I mean, the governor. And that's why she failed and he won. And I think some of the local leaders understand that and try to predict the black swan influence, because those black swans, like catastrophic events, fires, or some other social catastrophes, could catalyze certain changes and massive protest. What we really observed during the fire at the Trade Center, when like the whole YouTube and information in YouTube immediately spread it about like thousands of victims instead of dozens, and so on and so forth. And I think the people in power understand that that might be dangerous and try to manage that.
Mikhail?
Well, we are clearly at the breaking point of social trends, and at any of such breaking points, it's really hard to predict where it could lead. The major issue in terms of political landscape is for how long the public disaffection will stay at this current intensity. The previous episodes, such as social privilege monetization in 2005, they were very short. Basically, the approval ratings plummeted quite deeply for a while. But in 9 months from that moment, they recovered back again, and it was business as usual. Even during more prolonged period of public discontent in 2011, 2013, finally, the approval ratings recovered and everything stabilized. What will happen now is much less clear. And frankly speaking, among ourselves, the sociological group which is doing our research, we think that this time approval ratings may stay low for longer. And it's sort of, my friend and colleague Sergei Belanovsky says that the romance of public with the authority may be over for a while. That's how he calls this new trend. But still, it's just a speculation. We can't be certain for anything. As regards economic policy, it's a big question how intense these new populist expectations for social justice will be. Basically, they can be very disruptive to the sound macroeconomic and fiscal policy which is maintained by the authorities today. And this, if such a disruption occurs, it can open way to a longer period of economic instability and stagnation. It will complicate exit from the current recession. It can bring medium-term growth rates to negative from the current moderately positive growth rates. So these are the major trade-offs and uncertainties, and I must say, those who dare to predict what's coming next, I think they overtake their capacity to foresee the events, to foresee the future.
Thank you. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Yes, please identify yourself and be concise.
Thank you. My name is Brian Hayes. I'm a graduate student here at Georgetown. And my question is for Ms. Osetinskaya. What's your assessment of the impact of violence against journalists in Russia on their willingness to speak, and as you see a rise of YouTube or non-traditional media, are you concerned that people who write and post in those fora could also be targeted for murder or arrest?
Well, unfortunately, of these miserable events, they happen quite frequently, but the most recent event was associated with this trip to Central African Republic to investigate ЧВК Wagner Group, but I think it related more to poor organization rather than to violence from the Russian government, whose arms are long but not long enough, I think.
Control the Central African Republic.
Yeah, to fully control Central Africa, totally uncontrolled. So but interesting thing is that most people in journalism community don't, including me and including my team in Moscow, because I have 9 reporters on the ground, while I spend most time in California. So we don't apply these circumstances to ourselves. I mean, people consider their work as a regular, journalists consider their work as a regular work, as the same way as New York Times reporters. Maybe because of our previous 15 to 20 to 25 years experience. So, and I think the most journalists are the same in the way that just take this job as a regular job. And it doesn't influence the community in the sense of being more frightened by the violence. But the whole industry is eroded in terms of quality of people. The industry definitely loses to other industries in terms of quality of people, but there are different reasons for that. Did I answer?
Yes.
Thank you.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Dan Lieberman. Yes, there's violence against journalists or people who speak out in the government. Is that more from local nationalists or local problems with the police, or is that part of a national effort to silence journalists?
Well, it's hard to say because many cases are unsolved, but I believe those are still the local national groups rather than the policy. I don't think it's policy. I mean, and the state itself. Those are some people maybe affiliated with the state or having certain connections with the state, but definitely not the state policy.
Okay, we need to bring our panel to an end. I want to thank Dan and Elizaveta and Mikhail for sharing some really insightful and thoughtful perspectives on what's happening in Russia. And all of them have come a long distance. Dan and Elizaveta from California and Mikhail from Moscow. And I can say that in California and in Moscow in the past week, the weather's been better than here. I was in Moscow last week and it was 75 degrees every day. But I hope we have the opportunity to bring you back next year and we can look at how these trends are developing because they seem to be very fluid and dynamic. Thank you very much.